Good morning. My name is Richard Ponte, and I'm the Director of Events and Programs for the Maine State Chamber of Commerce. On behalf of the entire team here, it is my pleasure to welcome you to Introducing Maine Economic Vision 2035, the latest in our webinar series. Thank you for joining. Before we get going, there are just a few things we'd like to share with you about today's session. All participants are in listen-only mode. Please submit questions using the Q&A function. Time permitting, we will answer them by the end of the session. We will also use the Q&A feature to share useful links and other materials. We have enabled closed captioning in English. You can access this feature by toggling it on the taskbar at the bottom of your screen. This meeting is being recorded, and we will make the recording available to you on our website in the next few days. And finally, if you lose your connection, please use the same Zoom link to reconnect. We would now like to begin by thanking our sponsors. Our 2026 webinar series sponsors are AARP, Central Maine Power Company, Kennebec Savings Bank, KeyBank, NextEra Energy Resources, and Northeast Delta Dental. It is now my pleasure to introduce the President and CEO of the Maine State Chamber of Commerce, Patrick Woodcock. Patrick will be moderating the conversation today. Good morning, Patrick.
Well, good morning, Richard, and good morning, all. We're so pleased to discuss what is core to the Maine State Chamber's mission, and that's the state's economy, its outlook, and a vision for economic opportunity in the 10 years ahead. We are part of a partnership that really predates myself with Maine Development Foundation, with every 4 years putting a vision forward to inform our next leader of our state during a gubernatorial race of what the economic priorities we're hearing from the business community to inform sound public policy decision making. I don't have to tell any of the listeners that there's a lot of dynamics with our global, national, and state economy. Coming out of the pandemic, our state exceeded the national GDP, exceeded population growth. And we're starting to see concerning signals that we may be returning to pre-pandemic growth and population growth has been slowing. We really need to capture the public policies that will confront the challenges that the business community is experiencing and address our housing shortage, workforce availability, energy costs, and ensure that we have a permitting timeline that works to start saying yes to business activity. This partnership would not have been possible without our two other presenters today, Yellow Light Green with the Maine Development Foundation, and Heather Johnson, who led the effort in crafting our report. I now want to turn to Yellow Light Green with the Maine Development Foundation for some opening comments. Yellow?
Thank you, Patrick. It's been great to continue this partnership with you that started some years ago with our predecessors. And I think the motivation and ambition remains the same, which is to marry what MDF has been known for all these years in terms of data-driven, reputation for nonpartisanship with the chamber's deep reach across the state into the business community and build off these two core inputs, a survey of Maine business leaders that Heather will talk about, and those core data insights from measures of growth, and then building solution sets that don't try to reinvent the wheel, but try to leverage the best that's out there in the thinking across our state already. I would just comment before we get going that I think the ambition of the goals that we lay out in Maine Economic Vision 2035 reflect the urgency, as you just said, but also reflect our mutual optimism about Maine and the fact that we can achieve big things if we set a powerful direction and we persist in it together over the coming decade. So I look forward to getting into it today with the audience.
So at this point, I did want to turn to Heather Johnson, who conducted the survey with the Maine State Chamber and Maine Development Foundation for some baseline assessment of how the business community is assessing current economic conditions, strengths, and challenges. Heather, thank you so much for joining us this morning.
Yeah, thank you, Patrick and Yellow. And it was, a wonderful opportunity to work with both of you and your teams um, on this document. So, Richard, if you can go to the first slide, please. As we looked at the kind of survey and research elements of this, we tried to ask questions in multiple ways to really get underneath. And I think what you'll see is kind of a balanced response that probably won't surprise you a lot, right? Some real challenges, some real opportunities. And so we're going to just talk through those really quickly because that sets up these goals that Yellow mentioned. And then we'll also talk through some of the solutions to the goals, because part of why this document is a little bit different is it offers kind of direct and practical implementable solutions to help make progress toward the goals. So here are top supporting factors. Obviously, local talent is very clearly the top. When businesses responded, like what is working for them, their local talent. You'll see on a later slide, there's not enough local talent, but the local talent that we have is one of the key elements. Lots of discussion about key partnerships, proximity to markets, ecosystem support, natural resources. So you see a lot of things here, but I think the big takeaway on what are the supporting factors were how positive businesses were about the talent that does exist. It's very clear there's not enough of them, but that talent is important. Richard, if you can go to the next one. So having said that, kind of the balance here compared to 2 years ago, businesses says operating a business in Maine is harder now, pretty dramatically. So 58% harder, 8% easier. As you think about who responded here geographically, it was pretty diverse, and industry-wide, it was also pretty diverse. So again, not a lot of surprise. We've seen as the economy grew, the barriers to that growth became really clear, right? We hadn't seen growth in our economy for a long time. And so as we started to see that growth, the barriers became much more clear. So if we could go to the next one, this really tries to identify kind of that balance of local talent is the best supporting factor, but talent availability is also one of the biggest barriers to growth. New this cycle on this discussion was really a call out on uncertainty in policy and regulation and how much of a barrier that is to businesses being able to invest and grow here locally. Unpredictability, uncertainty are really creating some challenges and some barriers. And then 4 years ago, healthcare costs wasn't on this list anymore, and now it's back. So healthcare costs was kind of the top choice for a few of these. Fell off the survey 4 years ago and now is back. So you can see that, and energy costs have been kind of a trending upwards as a barrier over the course. And housing availability also wasn't a significant concern 4 years ago. It was a concern, but it didn't pop out quite as high. So having said that, right, and talking about the barriers, if you could go to the next one, Richard, we'll really talk about this investment plan as we asked companies, like, what do their investment plans look like over the next 3 to 5 years? You still see a pretty significant group saying that they want to expand operations. 44% wanting to expand here, recognizing that they had responded to all of the other barrier choices and understand that piece. I do think 12% thinking about relocating is something we should be very concerned about, and 12% reducing operations, again, something we should be very concerned about. 29% of the businesses making a major capital investment, that might be a smaller number than what we were anticipating as well. So again, some things to just keep track of, but also is the interesting balance. So in this slide, you can see the interesting balance. Lots of barriers and challenges, still planning to expand operation, lots of barriers and challenges, urgency around making some adjustments so that this 29% that want to make a capital investment will make it here. And then if you go to the last research slide, Richard, please, you can really see when you ask the question a different way, like what would improve our competitiveness? Not what are the barriers, but what would improve our competitiveness? you get back into this cost of doing business, lower taxes, energy costs, healthcare costs, and then workforce development, and then housing. So those are kind of the big buckets in what would improve Maine's competitiveness as a place to do business. So with that, I'm going to turn it back to Patrick and Yellow to talk through the goals and the solutions to the goals. And I think what you'll see is this research driving that part of the discussion. Patrick?
Well, thank you. Business competitiveness really is striking in how it's revealed in the survey results, regulation, energy costs, and taxes. And I really do, as you look at other states, there has been both blue, red states that have really tried to unlock a regulatory environment that does not undermine any of our environmental standards, but just accelerates the review. And our assessment is that by 2035, we can have a regulatory environment that is predictable, efficient, transparent, and allows projects to be permitted within 12 months. We really think that the next governor could establish an executive order to review both executive action, legislative, statutory changes to enable that. We have not been cited as a state that is easy to permit projects, but using new tools, artificial intelligence, using third-party permitting, looking at permit by rules, there really are some options that we can start saying yes to these projects in a way that gives more predictability. I'll speak about this later. Our energy costs have always been a challenge. The Northeast historically has had above average electric rates. However, what is really different is Maine has moved from what used to be a competitive advantage of being the lowest electricity rates in the Northeast. We actually have removed ourselves from that position. And we have to reclaim that with sound public policy, addressing our winter fuel vulnerabilities, and finally, reviewing our public policies to ensure that we're not adding on electric ratepayer bills and assessing other options to support public policy. I also want to point out that our tax environment is always critical. We do think that sometimes our tax policy is viewed within a budget, trying to make up for revenues. There are also consequences for our competitiveness of investing, retaining individuals in our state. And we do think that there should be a standing assessment of how to maintain a competitive tax environment for our industry, for our businesses here, and to attract new economic activity in our state. So that's our vision for 2035 to address our business competitiveness. And I'll turn now, if you would advance to the next slide here, turn to Yellow on productivity, research, and private investment.
Thanks so much, Patrick. The goal area that Patrick just spoke to really speaks a lot to the role of the public sector in setting appropriate policies and processes. Here in this next one, although similar, we're really focused on what is the environment and the progress in private businesses making the lion's share of those investments, including improving the day-to-day innovation and productivity of their businesses and their workforce. Our productivity relative to the nation, what we put out in goods and services per worker has improved in recent years, but still lags the nation by 20%. So our core goal here is to close that gap, reach the national average in productivity per worker, so that, as we discuss later on, we can grow wages. Second, directly track that private sector capital investment using the investment that is registered and tracked through the Dirigo Business Incentive Program as a proxy for that overall universe of private investment. And then third, and just as crucially, we know that research and development in all types is one of those critical corollaries to long-term economic prosperity. Maine has made significant absolute progress. We've increased our support, both through the university and otherwise for R&D. But nonetheless, we still are about 1/3 of the national average. And again, we set an ambitious goal here to triple our relative proportion of research and development in this state up to the national average in the coming decade. And the lion's share of that R&D is invested by the private sector. So there's pump priming on the public side, but the goal setting in this area really overall is aimed at setting a a significant stake and measuring progress towards that private investment portion that drives the economy. Next, I think we're back to Patrick.
Household affordability. Affordability has obviously risen sharply in uh, voters' interest with the rise of inflation. In Maine, what is really unique is housing appreciation and our exposure to energy costs, petroleum pricing, and that is getting worse, not better. Um, household affordability, it really comes down to ensuring that we're saying yes to all forms of housing development. We do need to reduce our zoning and regulatory barriers to incentivize housing development. Our housing costs have appreciated, our housing prices have appreciated um, by some measures, one of the highest levels in the United States, and it's leaving people in their 20s and 30s behind. We really need to start saying yes to housing that not only will expand our workforce, but also be the initiative that will stem housing cost appreciation. Um, Furthermore, and I'll get into those details, we really need to find partnerships with municipalities. There are housing leaders in our state, municipalities that are saying yes. I've visited groundbreakings for housing that will bring these solutions across the state. We need to have more of those examples, but moreover, that the state support those municipalities, really reward the best practices for the municipalities that are saying yes. Also, as Heather noted, our healthcare spending really has increased in our concern from the business community, and we really do need to focus on our healthcare, uh, whether it's primary care access, affordability, and really rural healthcare that's really illustrated in our Rural Healthcare Transformation Fund to really stabilize our healthcare services. So that's going to be really critical for our state. We really can't grow economy if we don't have a foundation of a healthcare system. And with that, I think I'm turning back to Yella.
Thanks, Patrick. Our fourth area of goal setting and solutions is what we call workforce and wages. And we talked about a couple of issues in the business survey in terms of both the sheer quantity of Maine's workforce, as well as the skills and talents and training that that workforce has. We set a goal here of reaching 70% of Maine's working age population having a credential beyond high school. This can be an apprenticeship, this can be an industry certificate, it can be a 2 and 4 year degree. That's up from about 55% in 2024. So that is not an easy lift. It will take doing a lot, sustaining a lot of the things we're doing now, as well as building on some best practices that we might not have. The second major goal talks about that quantity issue. Um, we have 100,000 plus Mainers that will reach age 65 this decade. And so making sure that we've got enough workers engaged in the workforce will take about 25,000 above existing trend lines to replace those retiring boomers over time. Again, easy to say, hard to do, and will take a quiver of strategies. And then finally, we know that it all starts pretty early. Unfortunately, we can predict with stunning precision what your academic and life economic prospects are if you can't read on grade level by the end of the third grade. And so unpacking that, reversing, that correlation is crucial. And so early care and education and the first few years of elementary education are an absolutely high priority place to overinvest. You might have noted as we've gone through these four goals, there's a quite deliberate equibalance between trying to meet some of the barriers and compelling incentives that help business make investment in our state. And these last two in terms of workforce and housing, where we're focusing on the needs and well-being of the workforce itself. And one of the things that's quite intentional in this year's project is, we talk a lot about ideological polarization in our society today, but we're trying to really tackle the economic polarization and say we're all in this together. There is no business that can thrive without the people and workers of Maine thriving, and the converse is true. And so you'll see a quite deliberate effort in the goals and solutions to marry those up. And as we turn to solutions, I just want to encourage, I see some questions flowing into the Q&A. I think we're going to have ample time for Q&A in the webinar. So I just encourage you to be planting those questions as you've begun to do. Back to you, Patrick, as we enter solutions.
You would advance the next slide. Thank you. So as I mentioned, here are the real solutions to achieve our goals. I think we do need to have a vision of getting a answer on permitting within 12 months. This is both a review at the executive level, but also through our legislative statutes governing our permitting process. I do see from a lot of projects that there could be more delegation to municipalities. Does Augusta need to review all housing projects that meet the site location of development standards? Could some projects be exempt if they meet certain thresholds? We really need to start focusing on the projects that have the most environmental consequences. And I do think that there is a lot of bipartisan support to review this in a thoughtful way. I think we always are assessing how our state regulatory environment aligns with other states too. And I think that is imperative as we look at new technology, as we look at digital advertising, that we are always looking at peer states. And we should be a leader in some areas, but also reflect that having consistency with other state borders is going to benefit consistency, cost of compliance, and ultimately alignment with other states should be a goal within itself. As we've discussed, short-term funding challenges should really be only one factor in looking at our tax structure. We really need a competitive tax environment, and that should be informed by a broad group of tax professionals that advise the administration and the legislature of what are the things that are effective in our tax structure as we look at peer states, and what are the areas to focus on. We obviously have concerns if there are any abrupt shifts in tax policy, but also a long-term vision of where we want to improve our tax competitiveness. And lastly, we have a huge transition underway, and that's with family businesses. Maine is a state of small businesses, and there is going to be a transition. And we have to make sure that those Maine-based businesses are supported with a tax environment that allows them to retain ownership here in Maine. The last thing we want to do is any structure that could unintentionally create an environment where we're seeing more consolidation or a shift to out-of-state ownership. So those are our focuses on the solutions to improve our business competitiveness. One aspect that I mentioned was losing our position as the lowest cost electricity retail price state in the Northeast. And I think this highlights this divergence This graph highlights index to 2015, what percentage change we've seen both in New England, in the United States, and in Maine. And I also included Vermont, which now includes the lowest electricity rates in New England. And the factors are multiple on why this is caused. I mean, all states have had some inflationary pressure, the cost of installing new distribution services. But in a regression assessment by the National Berkeley Laboratories, they looked at states on why we have seen such a divergence as electricity prices become such a concern. And in looking at Maine, there were four factors that really have led to us being one of the highest increases of states in the country. First, and you can see this, that this occurred, it really revealed itself in 2022, but we continue to be very exposed to winter natural gas price spikes. We are seeing that again in 2026, the advent of the Iranian conflict, and it is again a vulnerability that has bitten our Achilles heel time and time again. We really need to be focused on all solutions to address and reduce our exposure to these global prices. In addition, we have seen storm costs disproportionately affect the cost for customers as utilities recover those costs in electric bills. We've had significant storms, and we really need to focus on what are the investments that would reduce our long-term storm recovery costs. That can be as simple as expanded tree trimming, investments in hardening our distribution system, steel poles rather than wooden poles in high-risk areas. But we cannot be spending hundreds of millions of dollars for storm cost recoveries and expect that we'll be competitive with our electricity prices. Lastly, some public policies. The renewable portfolio standard costs have increased substantially, growing from about 10 years ago from about $10 million to $110 million from the last report from the Public Utilities Commission. Is there a way to continue to expand renewables, maintain operations of existing renewables without that high cost from that public policy? And lastly, our net energy billing program has been an outlier with the other states of the costs. And we need to look at, are there ways from either public policy funds outside of ratepayers that can continue to support those existing contracts? So we look forward to working with partners to maintain our environmental progress while reclaiming our historical position of the lowest cost electrical price state in the Northeast. I think I outlined this here. The only other additional points, really, it goes into our permitting process. We need the infrastructure. We need to be able to bring in new renewable projects, be able to be open to new energy sources. And also, we do need to look at demand side management and how can we encourage consumers to shift load to non-peak periods. And I'll turn
Thanks,
to
Patrick.
Yellow.
Getting back to our broad goal on workforce and wages, you'll recall we had set a general goal here to increase wages by 20% in relative terms to the nation. This graph just really visualizes that. I mean, the positive is that both are, sharply sloping upward in the right direction, but we need to get that orange line to converge with the blue line. There's some positive momentum there coming out of the pandemic, but as Patrick said at the outset of the hour, we want to preserve and accelerate that momentum. Next slide. In terms of solution set, it is going to take a panoply of strategies to hit our goal in terms of growing the workforce at a pace that's even commensurate with replacing retirees over time. I would just mention that one of those is certainly keeping older workers in the workforce longer with senior-friendly workplaces and creative strategies on the type of work and the part-time nature and the mentorship that they can offer. Um, but at the end of the day, there are not statistically a lot of 75-year-olds that still want to be in the workforce. So, we can only get so far there. Um, and that really comes, in large part in companionship with closing the housing barriers that Patrick will come back to solutions on. In terms of the skills and education, this section of the report really parallels achieving that 70% post-secondary attainment goal. There's a lot packed in there. Part of that is continuing to refine and strengthen the supports for folks who already matriculate into both degree and non-degree programs, but never finish. We have a lot of Mainers with some college or some training and no certification. And sometimes that results in them carrying debt without the ultimate earning power that they would have achieved at the end of that journey. So that's no doubt a big piece of it. We call out here a standing recommendation from the State Chamber of Commerce and our friends at Educate Maine, to really redouble K-12 student participation in our career and technical education programs. That's a big lift because it's a big lift just keeping those programs technologically contemporary with the workplace and continuing to have equipment and practices that reflect what's going on now versus 5 or 10 years ago. So easy to say, but would take a lot of persistent focus and ongoing investment to be sure. Those are just a few, frankly, of the strategies that are highlighted in the report and are really consonant with the recommendations of the Maine Spark Alliance, which is really galvanizing the state's pursuit of that 70% post-secondary goal. Next slide. When we talk about the gap between Maine and the nation, you can see one part of that gap reflected in the graph on this slide in terms of the percentage of Maine students testing proficient on the national benchmark versus the national average next to it versus the leading state in the country, which happens to be one of our near neighbors, Massachusetts, in both reading and math. And if we were able to achieve that 20%, 20-point jump as a state, we would be among the national leaders, if not the national leader. One of the things is we did it before. From the early 80s to the late 90s, Maine went from worst to first in a lot of K-12 education metrics. We have been struggling coming out of the pandemic to deal with learning loss and the long-term effects of social isolation on kids. But we've done it before and we know we can do it again, but it takes a long haul, nonpartisan commitment. And then finally, we stake out constant again with the Maine Spark goals that, we have a huge gap across our state. I believe the gap in post-secondary attainment in Maine is about 30 percentage points from the best county to the lowest, in the mid 60s in Cumberland County and in the mid 30s in one of our more rural counties. All counties need to progress. All regions need to progress. Nobody should slow down. But in doing so, we need to accelerate the progress in some areas to really close that gap within our own state as well. A lot to be done for sure. Shifting gears to another goal area, and the next slide. What are some of the solutions that we've laid out in this vision for productivity, research, and private investment? A few of the more tangible and trenchant recommendations include on the public sector pump priming side of the equation, tripling essentially the baseline funding of Maine Technology Institute, MTI. They have made a lot of impressive high leverage investments in everything from startups to technologically maturing companies who are trying to take their production to the next level. They always have an unfunded list of equally worthy companies and projects that we just never get to as a state. We certainly need to attract companies to our state in some of these high growth, high innovation areas. And then we need to look at our panoply of supports for business. One of the areas that has come out in our conversations with business leaders and economic developers across Maine is that as companies are maturing, companies who maybe 10 or 20 million today and want to get to 20, 50, or 100 million, they're at a stage where every other state on the in the country is trying to lure them away, and we need to make them see a pathway to a return on investment and the supports to continue to grow here. And then finally, and tying back to what we just discussed on workforce, we need a special emphasis on some of the workforce programming that is in those high growth, high wage areas. That's dynamic. We know we can't predict with certainty always where they're going to be in 5 years. Um, but we want to make sure that we're especially supporting public-private partnerships, which came up as a key asset from businesses that Heather was describing, those public-private training partnerships in those high growth, high wage areas. So again, I think in this area, you'll see shades of what became famous from my predecessor, Lori LaChance, which is there's no silver bullet. But in each of these areas, the vision document lays out the silver buckshot that we think taken together can get us there. Patrick, on to you.
Well, thank you. This really speaks to the statistics we've seen with affordability of housing. It's a lot of families are experiencing this. Um, we have really gone to unprecedented territory with the affordability and what it takes for an income to afford the median price home in our state. Historically, it's been about 30% of gross income. You can see that we have almost doubled that over the last 10 years. And the way we're going to address that is really expanding housing supply, increasing household income. That is how we're going to address our affordability gap. And it's going to take solutions to start saying yes to housing of all types. If you advance to the next slide, please. It's going to be making housing legal and predictable to build in residential growth areas. They should have projects that meet clear and objective standards. They really should move forward without any discretionary review. If this is a crisis of affordability, we should have some urgency to start saying yes to housing in designated growth areas. We should have statutory permit timelines for local and state approvals. And there are a lot of state environmental laws, a lot of federal laws delegated to the state for implementation. I do think we should look at eliminating housing as a review from our state site location of development law, which is really unique to Maine. A lot of these developments are already captured with reviews of under the Clean Water Act, Endangered Species Act, and municipalities ultimately are in position to review whether it works for their community. So we need to start saying yes to our housing and also start creating incentives for our municipalities with state support that are saying yes to housing. If you advance to the next slide. We are saying that there should be a $100 million competitive fund for municipalities to support housing development. Those should be for our municipal housing leaders, the ones that are saying yes, that are disproportionately adding housing to our state. And also there are some communities that have been saying no to housing production and putting up restrictive barriers to housing. That has statewide consequences. And I think it's a reasonable expectation that if municipalities are not adopting best housing practices, we cap additional revenue sharing above 2025 baseline. We need incentive structures for municipalities to be rewarded for the action that's helping our state's economy and encouraging communities to remove these restrictions on municipal development. Lastly, we really do have seen the historic rehabilitation tax credit and Maine's core affordable housing programs bring those housing solutions to those unique and specific areas of housing production. Those should be continued. And also, there should be some support for financing gaps, whether that's low interest loans to close gaps for workforce and mixed income housing projects. There are a lot of development that's occurring in some areas of our state. The cost to build have gone way up, and incomes have stagnated, and it's hard to get that financing. We should really be targeted at areas that are having trouble to finance the workforce housing solutions that the economy desperately needs. If you advance to the next slide. Yellow, I don't know if you want to start here and then I'll conclude.
Sure. Thank you, Patrick. Um, I think you've seen and probably heard in our comments throughout the morning that there is so much intersectionality between these facets of the Maine economy that you can't grow a business without an incredibly talented workforce, and you can't convince that employer community to be partners in developing that workforce if they are fighting too many headwinds on other procedural and substantive costs of doing business here. So everything about this is deeply intersectional with the other three goal areas and the panoply of strategies laid out in each one. I think importantly, this isn't about an abstraction. This is about Maine people, fundamentally. And this document, while it speaks heavily to policymakers and even specifically to the major role that Maine's next governor would play in advancing many of these goals and strategies, it won't happen unless Maine people are engaged, with this and are bought into encouraging the hard conversations about these priorities and ensuring that we persist in them as a state. Uh, Persistence is key, because there will be political oscillations, but if we set a powerful, ambitious direction like this and we stick to it, we will be in a far better place for the well-being of Maine businesses and Maine people in 10 years.
I'll just conclude by saying this vision should really unite the Maine people. And we really want this to work for all communities across Maine. We have a very diverse economy from rural areas to our urban areas. We need all corners of the Maine economy to really be successful. A focus on permitting, a focus on innovation, a focus on workforce, and ultimately, whoever is that next governor, we need an economic plan that the Maine people are bought into, that it's informed by data, and that they are committed to supporting. We don't want surprises when legislators and governor takes office. We need that vision and the details now, as it's really important. The state's margin for error with our state's economy is not endless. We really need to continue to focus on the success we've had post-pandemic and address the challenges that we're starting to see materialize from housing, energy, and workforce availability. Confront those challenges with some solutions. I want to thank everybody who's been a part of this, our advisory committee from both the Maine State Chamber Board and the Maine Development Foundation Board, and everybody invested in sound public policy. I see a few representatives on the call. I will certainly miss Representative Collmore, who's been a thoughtful voice on the Housing and Economic Development Committee. And I also, have seen Holly Sargent, who had a number of really courageous votes in the House. And we really do want to support both Republicans, Democrats, who are going to be partners on an economic vision that provides economic opportunity for our state. With that, we do have a time for a few questions. I'm opening up the slides here. Actually, the first question is from Representative Sargent. Happy to make the slides available. We'll distribute that to the participants. Thank you, Representative Sargent.
Patrick, I couldn't tell if you had started answering the question about Maine's tax structure and if you wanted to go on that, and I can also provide some context of what I hope is helpful data from MDF side.
Yeah, you want to start? I did type in an answer, but I could expand on that too. But why don't you begin?
Sure. I would just say like one of the most important things about debating, big picture tax structure is to have kind of a solid grounding in Maine state budget in terms of both revenue sources and expenditures. And so MDF put together a state budget primer, which is on our website under our Policy Leaders Academy tab. And a lot of this data is data generated by the state, but not generated in a particularly accessible or user-friendly fashion, and the primer tries to do that. So I would just say, as background for the question, the general fund side of Maine state government and federal funds are a huge part, by the way, of what the state does overall. But of the 5.8 billion a year that's general fund, about 2.8 is individual income tax. So as you're discussing it, keep that context in mind. And then in terms of what the state spends our general fund on, about 40% each are in education and in human services, respectively. And so, the education piece is interestingly just a little bit less all in than the 2.8 billion in individual income tax. So I think one question I always have is, given the pressure on property tax that we all see and hear every single week, and that slide that Patrick showed that showed the increasing divergence between the residential side of real estate valuation and incomes tells you why that pressure on the property tax is so painful. I think the big question to look at for folks as they debate the right tax mix for Maine is, what will you do to keep the pressure off property tax if you try to make a big move on income tax? I would just urge people to not take overly simplistic answers to that question as we all debate it as a state. And then the second big area is always the question of, can you, well, I would also say a question always comes up of, what is Maine's tax burden? And Maine's tax burden is unquestionably high in a relative sense across the country. Um, but two things about that, our incomes are lower. So also look at, what do we spend per capita, which is still high, but not quite as high. And bear in mind that it is very hard to take out from all these measures that we use to think about tax burden. It's hard to take out the taxes paid by non-resident visitors and non-resident homeowners. So all of the taxes paid by non-Maine residents are in that number. So we keep trying to get a better handle on how good of a job are we doing charging non-Mainers for some of the cost of our core infrastructure, but it's hard to get at that. And that brings me to my third big observation, Patrick, which is simply that, a big area to continue to explore is, how much more could we export the cost of critical services to the visitors and out-of-state property owners who use those services. There are a few constitutional ways to do it. None of them are foolproof as far as affecting some Mainers, probably. So you just have to be very thoughtful and not try to come up with a simplistic answer to a complex question, I guess, is one of the framing points I wanted to make to the questioner.
The Maine State Chamber of Commerce was pretty vocal about our opposition to the surtax that was imposed earlier this year. Uh, we believe it's a major step backwards for competitiveness. The tax over the biennial does not raise an enormous amount of revenue. It's a poor signal. And furthermore, as the Associate Commissioner of Tax indicated, for these individuals, they have the ability to plan for planning uh, uh, their income tax based on based on the sale of property. And as a result, you got to be really careful that they could plan around residency and avoid the tax. So we had a lot of concerns with the surtax proposed. Um, Moreover, we do think the overall tax burden has really, we need to look at both the lower income, what is the threshold of when you're going to be exposed to the income tax, as well as our marginal income tax is a part of our regional competitiveness. As Yellow mentioned, I think having some review to ensure that we are being competitive makes some sense. And this is viewed as not as a effort to just raise revenue, but grow the state's economy. The one thing I would caution with of, for the maybe a convenient initiative to look at out-of-state tax payers to pay more, we also have to think about also growing the state's tourism, and ensuring that we are a competitive state to visit for lower income households, and making sure that we continue the momentum we've had for growth of tourism and shoulder seasons. We need to have a four-season tourism economy. So that really should be the goal. How do we expand the state's economic activity for tourism?
Do you want me
Next
to queue up the
question.
questions, or have you got them?
Yeah. Next question on municipalities are straps. So managing housing projects is incredibly difficult. When talking about encouraging municipalities to be leaders in housing, funding capacity to make that happen, it's not on the shoulders of rural volunteers and staff. The budget did actually include some funding to support for regional building code officials. I think the question does raise that there's a huge spectrum uh, of services and professional staff at the municipal level. And I think we should recognize with goals that a municipality that is 30, 40,000 people is very different than 3,000. We do need to support for building code officials, for planning, but also have separate goals. I mean, each municipality should have targets for housing production that reflects their current state, reflects really their municipal character. So I do think that the question is appropriate, and I think the legislature has modestly supported that with some funding for regional building code support.
Patrick, I would just mention a few other resources. The Maine Office of Community Affairs, which was designed to try to restore some of the technical assistance to municipalities that was once a subdivision of the state planning office, is just really getting rolling again a year or two into the creation of that. And so hopefully they'll identify some of these gaps and start filling even more of them. And, we certainly work closely with a lot of communities through our Maine Downtown Center and a new project called Thriving Communities Model that we're partnering with the CD on. But we recognize exactly the thrust of the question, which is, the capacity at municipalities is often minimal to non-existent, and how do we all create support systems that help them tap into easy access, no wrong door, coaching and assistance.
Next question is childcare. No thoughts on childcare? Good question, Aaron. We had some internal debate of whether to make that a core goal. The Maine State Chamber of Commerce has supported higher reimbursement rates. That's been debated in the state budget over the last few years, and we have supported that. I have heard from a number of employers that they are looking at childcare services. We've seen a number of employers from Bath Iron Works partner with local providers, and we have been supportive of reimbursement rates. We do think this obviously falls into a workforce development, and we can't have a thriving workforce if we don't have support for childcare, and obviously that's prohibitively expensive. Beyond that, I'd be open to further discussions. This is not addressing all of our challenges as a state, but we certainly agree that childcare is a constraint on the state's overall workforce. Yellow, any comments on that?
Yeah, Patrick, if you turn into page 19 of the full length vision document, you'll see under the heading of prioritizing the investment in early childhood readiness and success, a reference beyond some of the things we rattled off on the slides today in terms of strengthening the early care workforce and expanding both public and private delivery of pre-K programs. We have a lot of school districts that offer pre-K programs, but the actual percentage of our 4-year-olds enrolled is only about 50%. So one of the goals that we didn't unpack yet this morning is to try to increase that actual pre-K enrollment from 50% to 70%. Again, that will take a lot to achieve, and that is entirely consistent with, I think, the goals that Maine Spark 2.0 is laying out for the coming decade as well. So we're trying to ensure synergy across these efforts that are speaking to the entire readiness and learning continuum.
Time for to try to get a few of these answered here. Uh, Question, based on what other states who have raised taxes, especially in the upper tax brackets, have experienced, what do you think will happen to the business climate in Maine? So there's been a lot of public policy research and assessment of some out-of-state migration from higher tax states. A lot of those new tax levels were fairly recent. Uh, I will say we see the outmigration from a few states, from New York, Massachusetts, California, and Illinois, trying to isolate it from pandemic effects. But we have seen some outmigration from those. So in my view, it is a cautionary tale. We do have New Hampshire right next to us with a zero income tax. And also, there's always a migration to Florida. And we just have to be cautious about that and constantly review our business climate. And I do think there's been a divergence in states. There used to be a cluster of sort of a middle of income taxes, and it's starting to diverge more from lower income tax states, zero income tax states to much higher. And I really do think we have to be careful of joining those ranks of high tax states. Do you want to take, Yellow, you want to take the question on productivity?
Yes. Why is Maine's productivity roughly 20% lower than the nation? Partly, it's our mix of economic sectors that we have. Two of our by far largest economic sectors are healthcare and retail, and those sectors have, in general, lower productivity than many other sectors. There are a lot of high-paying jobs in healthcare. There are also a lot of lower-paying jobs in sustaining, a significant healthcare infrastructure. So it's quite a continuum there. We did look, by the way, when we did the state's 10-year strategy in 2019 about whether it was driven by a higher proportion of part-time or seasonal jobs. And there wasn't as strong a correlation to that as you would think, because many other states also have a lot of part-time and or seasonal jobs of different types. So we certainly have plenty of those, but it didn't stand out as a driver of explaining the difference between Maine and the country necessarily. So we're not saying that healthcare or retail will shrink in the coming years. That's part of any kind of strategy we could adopt. But it's important that we grow higher value added, higher productivity jobs and occupations as well. And it's a big mix. Even when we were researching Maine's hospitality economy, again, there is a wide range between higher value added jobs in things like breweries and full service restaurants and lower value added jobs in certain other parts of the hospitality trade. So, every sector has some things that can contribute higher productivity and wages. And I think that's partly why we call out here not just research and development as something that sounds really test tubey or really cutting edge, but kind of the constant process improvement and investment in equipping a great workforce with, great tools, great equipment, great machinery, great technology for day-to-day work as well.
And I'll just conclude, Lucian, I think that's exactly the assessment. We do not want to create an incentive structure where we actually do not capture the 7.5% that we had prior to the surtax, and have a outmigration for tax purposes. And we have to be careful on our overall tax environment. Um, and if I understand the question on state housing platforms to do more housing, to gain housing uh, sold to out-of-staters, I'm not completely following the question, but I do think it's important that we recognize that saying yes to all housing types in cities, municipalities, those that don't have the rural healthcare challenges, you're not only adding that house, but you're unlocking the housing paralysis that we have right now. A lot of the issue we have with housing is that people are staying in their homes, and those that could downsize are staying in their house because there aren't affordable options. We've had a lock-in effect. So saying yes to all housing types starts to unlock the housing paralysis. And we have seen some regions, some cities that have really accomplished that across across the country. We're really in the Northeast an outlier in that we have not, we've still seen this appreciation of pricing, and there's been a softening in other states, regions that have said yes to housing. And I will conclude. I think I made a comment about tourism, and we are at time. But Yellow, any last comments? But thank you for your partnership. Thank you to Heather for all the efforts in spearheading Maine Economic Vision 35.
Yeah, this has been a privilege to work with the chamber and to work with Heather's project management on this. And, among everything else, we're trying to make sure that this is a proactive, high profile priority for Maine people and for Maine policymakers. There are so many issues jockeying for their attention, and certainly so many issues affecting each of our households and businesses day to day. But to get anywhere in terms of where we want to be, in terms of education, in terms of business climate, in terms of innovation, will take a lot of work collaboratively that stays the course for the long haul. We're optimistic Maine can do it and Maine will do it. And, we're thrilled to bring whatever we can from Maine Development Foundation and the State Chamber to that challenge.
Well, thank you all for joining this morning from the Maine Development Foundation, the Maine State Chamber of Commerce. Thank you for your attention to Maine's economy, for joining our webinar. We'll be taking a bit of a summer break, but we'll be back in September for our monthly webinar series. Thank you so much to our partners, our sponsors, and to the Chamber staff in making this webinar successful today. Thank you all.